When investigators arrived at the scene, what did they see?
They found the victim deceased in her own bathtub. She had bruises on her throat. She had a gag in her mouth.
The scene itself was rather confusing. Her drawers were open, her purse was strewn about.
Investigators initially didn't know if this was an intruder or it was a stage crime scene.
This was a very good person murdered in her own bed late at night. It just doesn't get any worse than this.
I just remember thinking, if I have to live the rest of my life not knowing what happened here, I don't think I can do that.
He knew her pattern, knew her routine. This was calculated.
He had these scratches on him, which could be considered defensive wounds from her.
What went through your mind when you heard who was responsible for your daughter's murder?
Totally shocked. It makes me sick to my stomach.
Hi, I'm Paula Zahn, and tonight we're on the case in Salt Lake City, the state capital of Utah. The dynamic cultural center in the shadows of the Wasatch Mountains became the unlikely setting for a disturbing mystery when 16-year-old Lecia Schollmeyer was found viciously murdered in her own home. The savage crime and contradictory evidence baffled law enforcement for decades and left her heartbroken family to wonder if they would ever see justice. December 5th, 1977. It was a cold Monday afternoon in Salt Lake City when Sally Cadlick received a phone call from the manager of the restaurant where her 16-year-old daughter, Lecia, waited tables. When Lecia's employer called you, what did she have to say?
Lecia didn't show up for work today. Did she go out of town? Did she tell you anything?
Sally was surprised. Although Lecia was just 16 years old, she had been responsible and independent enough to get her own apartment just a mile from her family home. Was she always dependable?
Yes. She had a job. She was paying her bills. She wasn't your typical 16-year-old. She was living her life as though she was 20.
Lecia had just recently moved into the apartment and didn't have a phone, so her mother drove over to check on her. What happened when you showed up at her apartment building?
I knocked on the door, and she didn't answer.
Then did you begin to worry?
Oh, yeah. I was worried that she might be there and maybe hurt or sick.
Panic set in when Sally realized she didn't have a key to get in.
So then I went down and asked the manager if he'd let me in the apartment.
What was his reaction?
And he says, oh, okay. And he let me in.
Once inside, Sally quickly began to assess the situation.
I went into her room, and I saw the window was open to the fire escape, and her purse was there. And I said, she would never go anywhere without a purse.
Then Sally looked into Lecia's bathroom and saw a sight no mother should ever have to see. Her daughter's lifeless body lying in the bathtub.
And then I just lost it.
Was there any doubt in your mind that she was gone?
No, I knew she was dead. I knew immediately.
What a horrific thing for you to have to see.
It was.
Lecia's mother and the manager ran to his office to call police. When investigators arrived at the scene, what did they see?
They found the victim deceased in her own bathtub. She was totally without clothing. There were clothing items scattered around her bedroom.
Was her body submerged in the water?
Partially submerged.
It appeared that Lecia had been strangled during a violent, sexually motivated attack.
She had bruises on the outside of her throat. She had a gag in her mouth. There was a halter top over her eyes. They found pieces of rope in the bathtub, and the way that her body was positioned and was very suggestive that her hands had been tied together behind her back.
But other clues police found weren't as easy to piece together.
The scene itself was rather confusing. It was a really bizarre scene.
One item that puzzled detectives was the knife on the floor near Lecia's body.
In front of the bathtub on the rug was a very large kitchen knife.
There was no blood at the scene. The knife was checked and there was none indicated.
Could investigators determine whether the killer brought the knife with him or whether it came from Lecia's apartment?
There was one missing from the kitchen, so they were fairly early on able to determine that it was her kitchen knife.
And although the clues in the bathroom pointed to a sexual attack, there was also evidence that raised a lot of questions about how the crime unfolded. Did it appear as though robbery was a motive?
Her drawers were open, her purse was strewn about.
And while it appeared the killer was looking for items to steal, police found many valuables that had been left behind.
There was a stereo in a closet that hadn't been taken, and a TV that was on a dresser. So that kind of confused investigators. Was this really a robbery?
Lecia's front door had been locked when her mother arrived. The discovery raised doubts about how the killer entered the apartment.
Lecia lived here on the second floor. Her bedroom window opened onto that fire escape right there. When investigators arrived, they found that her bedroom window was open and also the screen had been pulled off. This is a red flag saying, look, somebody climbed up the fire escape and entered through the window and assaulted her.
But investigators couldn't be certain. The ladder to the second floor fire escape was not easily accessible from the ground.
They actually measured it to be 10 to 12 feet, and so it would have been difficult to get up there to get that ladder.
The distance between the ladder and the ground led authorities to believe that the killer may have entered the apartment through the front door and then used the fire escape to flee the crime scene. And officers quickly found additional evidence that supported that theory.
There was a blanket tied to the railing right there on the fire escape.
Could Lecia's killer have used the blanket to climb back down to the ground?
It was definitely something that needed to be ruled in or ruled out. They really had a whole lot on their plate to look at.
In fact, the only thing investigators were certain of was that a talented and loving 16-year-old had been viciously killed in her apartment, and that solving her murder wouldn't be easy. Police investigating the murder of Lecia Schollmeyer were stunned by the brutality of the crime. It appeared the teenager had been violently strangled to death during a sexually motivated attack. Now, as investigators tried to piece together the puzzling clues the killer left behind, Lecia's family was wrestling with an even more tormenting question. Was there someone in their lives who might have wanted to hurt the kind-hearted teenager? Even 42 years later, those painful days following the discovery of Lecia's lifeless body still haunt her mother.
I didn't think I could possibly live without her.
The unanswered questions were tormenting.
I just remember thinking, if I have to live the rest of my life not knowing what happened here, I don't think I can do that.
Lecia's sister Bridget, then just 12 years old, remembers the sense of loss that gripped her family. What was she like?
She's the ringleader of everything we did. She was 16, but she was an adult.
You really counted on her direction, didn't you?
Yeah, I think our whole family did.
Do you remember just how fiercely independent she was?
Yes, she was making a life for herself. I didn't realize that that wasn't normal. I just figured, oh, when I'm 16, I will be out on my own, working a full-time job. And, I just figured that's what you did.
Lecia's family told police that in the days leading up to her murder, Lecia had saved enough money to move into a nicer place. What didn't she like about the apartment?
She didn't like the people that lived there.
And Lecia became committed to moving out after her apartment was robbed, just a month before her murder.
She had come home from work one night, and the door of her apartment was just lying on the floor.
When Lecia's mother described the stereo that had been reported stolen, detectives were troubled. Police had found it inside her apartment following the murder.
It was very confusing. How does this stereo end up in her closet?
Investigators wondered if there was some connection between the robbery and Lecia's murder.
Investigators initially didn't know if this was a stage crime scene.
Analysts carefully dusted the fire escape, the windows, and anything else Lecia's killer might have touched. Were there any fingerprints that were lifted that yielded any clues?
No, nothing was found.
The results of Lecia's autopsy added a layer of brutality to the mystery. What was the cause of Lecia's death?
Strangulation, which is a horrible, horrible way to be killed.
But the medical examiner could not find evidence that Lecia had been sexually assaulted.
That could have been in part because she had been underwater, and biological evidence would have been washed away.
Police also spoke with those closest to Lecia to try to establish a timeline of her last known whereabouts. Her family had seen her the Saturday before her death.
We picked her up and then went apartment hunting with her.
What time do you think you dropped her off?
Around 1 or 2.
Lecia then got ready for her waitressing shift a few hours later.
Lecia actually worked Saturday afternoon from 5 to 9:30.
But the timeline came to an end a half hour later.
And then she was last seen alive at 10 o'clock on Saturday night. Her friend Lorraine, who lived in the apartment next door to Lecia's, came over and borrowed some laundry soap at 10 p.m.
Did Lecia seem to be acting her normal self?
Absolutely. She was in her bathrobe, getting ready for bed, and everything was fine.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe Lecia had been attacked shortly after she fell asleep. Was it likely she was awakened by her killer?
Yes. It appears that the killer entered her bedroom, used the kitchen knife to force compliance, bound her feet, bound her hands, put a gag in her mouth and a blindfold over her eyes.
Her halter tops had been ripped, and those halter tops were used as the blindfold and the gag.
Detectives carefully studied the bindings, in particular, the knots the killer used to tie them in place. Police also focused on the fact that nearly all the items he used in the crime belonged to Lecia. Did investigators think Lecia might have known her killer?
Yes. Why would you put a blindfold over her eyes otherwise?
Officers canvassed the entire apartment complex, hoping for a lead.
All the occupants were contacted. All of them were interviewed. None of them had heard anything suspicious the night Lecia died.
The police spoke with the apartment manager. Did he see anything unusual that night?
Yes, he reported that he came in late in the early morning hours from a party and saw a suspicious smell inside of the apartment hallways that was not a resident.
He said he didn't recognize that person.
The vague tip was the best one investigators had received. Had Lecia's apartment manager actually seen her killer fleeing the crime scene? Salt Lake City police were investigating the murder of Lecia Schollmeyer. The 16-year-old had been found strangled to death in her own apartment. Detectives hoped there was a clue somewhere in the confusing crime scene that would lead them to a suspect. But so far, the puzzling evidence had only raised even more questions. The savage murder of well-liked teenager Lecia Schollmeyer had residents of Salt Lake City concerned about their own safety. What kind of an impact did Lecia's murder have on the community?
It was a huge news story at the time. This was a very good person murdered in her own bed late at night. It just doesn't get any worse than this.
How frustrated were investigators by the lack of progress in the case?
They were very frustrated. They did a tremendous amount of work on the case. They talked to everybody they could.
And while the massive canvas of Lecia's neighbors had provided few clues about what happened to her that night, the interviews did point investigators to a man who lived in an apartment across the alleyway from Lecia's.
Several people reported a suspicious man that lived in the apartment building next door. He lived up there.
One of Lecia's neighbors had even noticed the man peeping into the teenager's apartment a few nights before her murder.
He observed the man staring from his bedroom window down into Lecia's bedroom window.
But when investigators questioned the man, he denied the allegations. He claimed he had been away on the night of Lecia's murder. His alibi eventually checked out. Could they find any evidence connecting him to the murder?
No.
Police were still confident there was a clue at the crime scene that would help identify a suspect. And they quickly focused in on one piece of evidence. Almost everything the killer used to commit the murder had belonged to Lecia, except for the rope found in the bathtub. Detectives believe the killer had brought it with him. How would you describe the type of rope that was found in her apartment?
It was more like a clothesline than a rope. It was made out of cotton.
When investigators collected the rope, where were they hoping that would take them?
They're hoping that they could find the rest of the spool of rope in the possession of somebody.
They also hoped they might trace that rope back to the store where it had been bought.
They did find a market right up the street from the apartment building that carried identical rope.
As officers questioned the owner about any recent sales, a young man inserted himself into the conversation. What did he tell them?
He told them that he had recently bought the same kind of rope.
It had to raise suspicions,
Yeah.
not that out of the blue this young man approached them and said, hey,
Yeah.
I bought the same kind of rope you're looking at right here.
Yes, that's very odd. That piqued their interest.
Investigators were curious enough about his behavior to speak with the managers of the boarding house where the young man lived. But their lead fizzled when they learned he had a carefully monitored nightly curfew and could not have been involved in the murder.
They were able to rule him out pretty quickly, that he didn't have anything to do with it.
As detectives continued to formulate a theory of the crime, they became convinced that Lecia's killer was not a stranger. It was clear to them she had been targeted.
The conclusion was that, somebody that knew her pattern, knew her routine, and knew she lived alone. This was calculated.
Police asked Lecia's mother to think about any recent events in her daughter's life that might have sparked the attack. And she mentioned an incident with a young man who lived in the apartment directly below hers. His name was Lonnie, and the way Lecia had become friends with him now seemed important. She had been Lonnie's pen pal while he was behind bars.
Lecia actually felt sorry for Lonnie because he was in jail. He seemed very depressed, and so she tried to cheer him up.
Lonnie appreciated the kind words in Lecia's notes and had read more into them than Lecia intended.
He sort of got infatuated with her.
Shortly after Lonnie was released, he asked Lecia to go out with him, but she turned him down.
Her diary reflects it. She told him how she really felt about him. "I'd like you, but I'm not really interested."
Did investigators think that rejection might have been a motive for murder?
Yes, of course they did.
And evidence linking Lonnie to the murder continued to mount when they dug deeper into his background. It appeared that his short stay in the county jail wasn't the first time he had been in trouble with the law. What did investigators learn about his criminal history?
They learned that Lonnie had been arrested by the Denver PD for homicide in 1971.
So that's just 6 years before Lecia's murder.
Yes.
Law enforcement brought Lonnie to the station for a formal interview. When he arrived, police noted several telltale injuries.
He had scratches on his back and chest.
Investigators wondered if he had received those scratches during the vicious attack on Lecia.
It just seemed like a very odd timing. He had these scratches on him, which could be considered defensive wounds from her.
How did that finding impact the investigation?
That ratcheted Lonnie up into the #1 suspect position.
All of the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Lonnie knew Lecia, lived in her building, and had a motive for the attack. What a final clue police were about to discover sealed the case against him. The investigation into Lecia Schollmeyer's murder had zeroed in on a prime suspect, the young woman's downstairs neighbor, Lonnie. The convicted felon had a history of violence, and it appeared that he also had a motive for the attack. Lecia had repeatedly rejected Lonnie's romantic overtures. Now police hoped they could get Lonnie to confess to the crime in the interrogation room. When Salt Lake City police brought their prime suspect in for questioning, routine photographs of his body revealed critical evidence. Lonnie had scratches on his chest and back. What was his explanation for the scratches on his body?
He said that his girlfriend he was living with, Kathy, had a nightmare and was scratching him.
When police spoke with Kathy, did she corroborate that story?
No, she did not. She said she did not scratch Lonnie.
Detectives asked the medical examiner to analyze Lonnie's injuries.
He reported that those scratches were anywhere from 72 hours to 5 days old, which would put the infliction of those scratches squarely in the time frame of the murder.
When did Lonnie say he sustained them?
24 hours earlier. The medical examiner specifically said that that could not be true. He was clearly lying about it.
Lonnie also wasn't honest about his relationship with Lecia.
Lonnie initially was trying to distance himself from Lecia. He told investigators he didn't really know her, barely said hi to her.
But as the questioning intensified, Lonnie's story slowly changed. He admitted that he had been romantically interested in Lecia. When investigators pressed him, what did he say?
He said that he and Lecia had a talk, and he said he didn't like it, but she was not interested in him, and he just moved on.
Even Lonnie's alibi for the time of Lecia's murder raised doubts. Where did Lonnie say he was on the night of the murder?
He was with Kathy that night in their apartment, sleeping.
Was it possible that he could have slipped out of the apartment while Kathy was sleeping and she wouldn't have heard him?
Absolutely.
And Lonnie's apartment offered easy access to the fire escape that led to Lecia's window.
Lonnie and his girlfriend lived on the first level of the apartment complex here. Lonnie could have gone up to Lecia's apartment without anybody knowing.
Investigators continued to dig, and they found a clue that seemed to firmly tie Lonnie to the crime scene. A witness who connected Lonnie to the mysterious stereo found in Lecia's closet.
You saw Lecia's stereo inside Lonnie's apartment.
The witness told police he had seen the stereo there the day before Lecia's murder. The story helped law enforcement to piece together a new theory of how the chilling crime unfolded.
The theory was maybe Lonnie knocked on the door, told Lecia, hey, I got your stereo back, here it is. Gave it to her, she puts it in the closet, and then he attacks her.
And after the savage attack was over, Lonnie used the fire escape to make his way back to his ground floor apartment unseen. But despite all the circumstantial evidence police found linking Lonnie to the crime, prosecutors believe the case wasn't strong enough to charge him. Could detectives connect any evidence found at the crime scene to Lonnie?
No. No, there was no direct evidence putting him at the crime scene.
Those investigators had a rough time. A lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing to prove Lonnie did it.
Authorities had no choice but to release Lonnie from custody. Just days later, he packed up and left town.
Lonnie left Salt Lake City shortly after the murder and never came back.
Investigators began to fear that their best chance of solving Lecia's murder may have disappeared along with him. Why did Lecia's case begin to stall?
They exhausted all their leads. They canvassed every single person in the apartment house, and then the case just went cold.
It seemed to be the story of this case that one lead after another leads to nowhere.
But while the years rolled by without justice for Lecia, DNA technology continued to advance. And that science was about to reveal critical evidence that would reignite her cold case. The Lecia Schollmeyer murder investigation had gone cold. The prime suspect, Lecia's 19-year-old downstairs neighbor Lonnie, had left Salt Lake City, and police had never found that elusive piece of evidence they needed to make an arrest. Over the years, the case was reopened several times, but each attempt had led detectives to the same dead end. While police remained frustrated by their inability to bring Lecia Schollmeyer's killer to justice, her mother, Sally, was forced to face the possibility that her killer might never be caught. What was it like for you to live not knowing for sure who murdered Lecia?
I actually developed a theory that I knew who had done it. And for 40 years, I've thought if he doesn't get punished, I have no control on that. It helped me to get by.
Then, in 2016, investigator Hillary Gordon took on the case. When you poured through the case file for the first time, did you think this was a case that could be solved?
Absolutely. Everybody was stuck on this theory that it was Lonnie, and I just wanted to start clean and read every single note, every interview.
But it was the physical evidence that really intrigued detectives. There appeared to be crime scene evidence worthy of modern DNA testing.
They started with what they thought were the most practical items to test: the bedspread, her panties, the knife, and nothing yielded a suspect profile.
The setbacks only added to the officers' resolve. They asked for testing of every item police had taken from Lecia's apartment, including clothing the killer used to bind and blindfold Lecia. What did you think the chances were that the killer left any DNA behind?
I thought it was 50-50. Those halter tops that were used as the blindfold and the gag, I figured when he tied them, DNA would be left where the tie marks were.
Investigator Gordon sent the bindings to the lab for testing using the latest in cutting-edge DNA technology.
We were able to do what's called an MVAC, which is a process of sucking all of the possible DNA off of an item, and it goes into a filter, and then having that filter tested.
The results were unexpected.
In the knot of the gag itself, they found male DNA.
For the first time in the investigation, police believed they had the physical evidence they needed to prove that their prime suspect, Lecia's downstairs neighbor Lonnie, had committed the crime. Technicians compared a sample of his DNA to the profile they obtained from Lecia's clothing. The results were shocking.
There was no match.
After decades of suspicion, it turned out that Lonnie had not been Lecia's killer. It was a crushing blow, but investigators regrouped and entered the unknown DNA profile into CODIS, the national database. Was there a match?
Yes, there was.
To whom?
Patrick McCabe.
After 39 years, detectives finally had a name. Take me back to that moment when the results came in, the DNA testing.
Oh, man, that was amazing and rewarding and heartbreaking all at the same time. I was so thrilled.
And when law enforcement reviewed their records, they were stunned to find that Patrick McCabe had a connection to Lecia. Was that a name that was anywhere to be found in the case file?
Yes. Patrick McCabe was the apartment manager at the time Lecia was killed.
Police discovered that McCabe had access to Lecia's home.
He had a key to all the apartments.
In fact, it had been Patrick McCabe who unlocked the front door for Lecia's mother to check on her. It now appeared that McCabe may have been responsible for the gruesome scene she discovered that morning. What was your reaction when investigators told you the DNA hit was on Patrick McCabe?
Totally shocked. It was terribly offensive. How could he dare watch what I was going to find? Makes me sick to my stomach today.
As detectives dug deeper, they learned that McCabe had left Salt Lake City shortly after Lecia's murder. He bounced around the country before he was arrested in Florida. Why was McCabe's DNA entered into the CODIS system?
Mr. McCabe assaulted a 14-year-old girl in Florida in 1998.
McCabe served just 1 year behind bars and was now a free man. But police were able to quickly locate the 59-year-old felon. How did you go about finding him?
He was on the sex offender registry, so he wasn't too hard to find. He was living on a horse ranch in Florida.
Investigator Cordon Parks boarded a plane for Florida and knocked on McCabe's front door. Was he surprised to see you?
He was kind of strange. He came with us without even asking why we were there to see him.
And that's because even 4 decades later, McCabe seemed to know exactly what the detectives wanted to discuss.
We said we wanted to talk to him about an old Salt Lake City cold case, and he said, oh, the girl from the apartment house.
As Investigator Parks began his questions, he was careful not to reveal anything about the evidence police had discovered. He asked McCabe if he had ever done work in Lecia's apartment. What did he say?
He was adamant that he had never been in the apartment, he had never touched any articles of her clothing, he had no relationship with her.
Why was his denial critical to your case?
Because if he said that he was intimately acquainted with Lecia and had been in her apartment many times, that could have very much complicated our case.
Parks used McCabe's own words against him and locked him into a lie.
We asked him if there's any reason whatsoever his DNA would be inside Lecia's apartment. He said no. And then we confronted him.
You had a blindfold and a gag in her mouth. Your DNA was found on her. That's why we're here talking to you. It's your DNA matched the CODIS, and that's why we came down here to talk.
I knew they had a reason.
How did your DNA get on her body?
I don't know.
You had a key to get into her apartment. You went into her apartment and you killed her.
Didn't happen.
You did not sexually assault her, right?
Did not.
You did not tie her up.
I did not.
But the guilt over what he had done weighed heavily on McCabe. Just a few days later, he reached back out to detectives.
I was told that Patrick McCabe wanted to confess to Lecia's murder.
I'm here to admit that I murdered a young girl in 1977 in Salt Lake City, Utah.
McCabe slowly revealed in chilling detail how he used his key to enter Lecia's apartment in the middle of the night.
He'd been out partying, and he went home, and he laid down on the couch in his own apartment, and he had this obsessive thought about Lecia.
Tell me a little bit about what happened.
I was the manager of her apartment building. I went into her room, middle of the night. I saw her. I tied her up, and I raped her.
He said he used articles that were in her bedroom to tie her up, and then he said he raped her on her own bed.
Why Lecia?
Because she lived alone, she was young, she was attractive.
McCabe's confession lined up with the evidence police found at the crime scene.
He said he just decided he needed to kill her so she couldn't identify him. So he strangled her in the bathtub.
And as fear and panic set in, and I choked her to death.
Did he ever show remorse for what he had done?
No. I asked him if he would write an apology letter to Lecia's family. He just said no, he didn't want to do it.
Investigator Parks believes McCabe then staged the scene to make the crime look like a botched robbery.
He did that by opening the window and pushing the screen wide open and tying the blanket to the rail.
Evidence that made Lecia's neighbor Lonnie appear to be the prime suspect.
I think he did that in an attempt to divert attention from himself because he had this pass key to the entire apartment building.
But it was the final detail of the crime that stayed with investigators.
I mean, this man let Sally into that apartment knowing full well that she was going to find her murdered daughter in the bathtub. How cold is that?
Following his confession, McCabe was arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
And his attorney approached us and said, Patrick does not want to put the family through a trial, but he doesn't want to die. What can we do? So our office decided that we would take death off the table to spare the family yet more tragedy. And he then pled guilty to a murder in the second degree, an aggravated burglary.
McCabe was sentenced to serve 10 years to life in the Utah State Prison. At the hearing, Lecia's mother came face to face with the man who had taken so much from her.
He was a pathetic old man and disgusting. I really couldn't even look at him. It was almost like he felt almost more sorry for himself.
The final verdict closed a painful chapter in the lives of Lecia's family and lifted a dark cloud that had been hovering over them for more than 40 years.
I'm really grateful because it certainly has lightened the burden.
But that doesn't mean Lecia's loved ones don't feel the loss every day.
I think she would have been a great mother. I really wish she would have been here for my kids.
She is as much part of our family today as she ever was. We talk about her, we remember her. She'd be 60 years old now. I'd love to see what she looks like. We enjoyed having her with us so much. She's missed.
Police continue to investigate the possibility that Patrick McCabe may have been involved in other unsolved violent crimes in both Utah and Florida. I'm Paula Zahn. Please join us next time when we're back on the case.